Imagine spending your entire career in the shadow of greatness, where every achievement you earn comes with whispers of nepotism. This was the reality for Katherine Hackman, daughter of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman. Despite forging her own path in the culinary world, the shadow of her father's fame followed her everywhere. But on one fateful evening at Le Ciel Bleu, one of New York's most prestigious Michelin-starred restaurants, that shadow would both haunt and protect her in ways she never imagined. Comment where you're watching from today, as we dive into a story about assumption, humiliation, and the swift hand of karma. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers bathed the dining room in golden light, reflecting off hand-polished silverware and crystal stemware that adorned each immaculately set table. Le Ciel Bleu wasn't just a restaurant. It was a temple of gastronomy where reservations were secured months in advance, and dinner for two could easily exceed the monthly rent of most Manhattan apartments. The air carried the delicate scent of truffle and saffron, punctuated by the gentle murmur of Manhattan's elite discussing business deals and social gossip. Katherine Hackman entered the restaurant with quiet confidence. At 42, she carried herself with the understated elegance of someone who had nothing to prove, dressed in a simple black dress that spoke of refined taste rather than ostentatious wealth. Unlike many children of Hollywood royalty, Katherine had deliberately steered away from the spotlight, choosing instead to pursue her passion for food writing and culinary criticism. Her work was respected in culinary circles, though few outside that world made the connection to her famous father. Tonight was different, however. Katherine wasn't here as a critic, but as a guest, celebrating her recent award for excellence in food journalism. She had specifically requested no special treatment, no announcement of her lineage, no preferential seating. She wanted to experience the restaurant as any other patron would, to savor both the cuisine and the atmosphere without the weight of her family name. "Your table will be ready shortly, madame," the maitre d' informed her with practiced deference, gesturing toward the opulent waiting area near the bar. "Perhaps a drink while you wait?" Katherine nodded, making her way to the polished marble bar where mixologists performed their craft with theatrical precision. She settled onto a velvet-upholstered stool, ordering a simple gin martini while observing the ballet of servers and sommeliers attending to the dining room. It was then that she first noticed him, a waiter who moved with exceptional grace and authority. Tall, immaculately groomed, with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes that surveyed the room like a general commanding his troops. His name tag read Marcel, and from the way other staff deferred to him, Katherine surmised he was the head waiter, perhaps even the maître d'hôtel. Something in his demeanor suggested he was accustomed to catering to the whims of the powerful and wealthy, a gatekeeper of culinary exclusivity. Across the bar, a commotion was brewing. A young woman with a designer handbag and meticulously styled hair was speaking loudly into her phone, her voice carrying an unmistakable tone of entitlement. "Do you have any idea who my father is?" the woman was saying, her voice pitched to ensure everyone heard. "We shouldn't have to wait for anything. This is ridiculous." Katherine observed with quiet interest as Marcel approached the woman with the practiced smile of someone who had dealt with countless such scenes. "Madame, I assure you, we're doing everything possible to accommodate you," he said smoothly. "However, as I mentioned, without a reservation—" "My father plays golf with the owner," the woman interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "When he hears about this, you'll be lucky to keep your job." Katherine took a sip of her martini, feeling a twinge of sympathy for Marcel. She had witnessed this scene countless times, the weaponization of family connections, the implicit threat in dropping a powerful name. It was precisely the kind of behavior she had spent her life avoiding. Marcel maintained his composure, his smile never faltering, though something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps weariness, perhaps contempt. "Of course, madame. Let me see what I can do." As he turned away, the woman's companion, a man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit that suggested wealth without taste, caught her looking. "Enjoying the show?" he called out, his voice carrying the slight slur of someone on his third cocktail. Katherine shook her head slightly and returned to her drink. The last thing she wanted was to be drawn into someone else's drama. But the man was not to be deterred. He slid off his stool and moved closer, invading the bubble of privacy Catherine had carefully constructed around herself. "You look familiar," he said, studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Do I know you from somewhere?" "I don't believe so," Catherine replied politely but firmly, shifting slightly to create distance. "No, I definitely know that face," he insisted, snapping his fingers as if to jog his memory. "Were you in that reality show about chefs? My girlfriend watches all that garbage." "No, I'm a food writer," Catherine said, hoping the simple explanation would satisfy his curiosity. The man's companion, the woman who had been making demands, joined them now, her eyes narrowing as she assessed Catherine from head to toe. "A food writer?" she repeated with poorly disguised skepticism. "For like a blog or something?" There it was, the subtle dismissal, the implication that Catherine couldn't possibly be successful or important in her own right. She had encountered this attitude throughout her career, particularly from those who didn't recognize her by name. "I write for several publications," Catherine said simply, not elaborating further. She glanced toward the dining room, hoping her table would be ready soon. "Oh my God, wait," the woman said suddenly, her eyes widening. "Catherine Hackman? Gene Hackman's daughter?" The surname had finally registered. And just like that, the dynamic shifted. The woman's dismissive expression transformed into one of calculated interest. "I absolutely adored your father in The French Connection. Such a classic. You must tell me what he's really like." Catherine had fielded these questions her entire life. People who had no interest in her work, her thoughts, or her accomplishments suddenly became fascinated when they connected her to fame. But before she could formulate a polite deflection, Marcel appeared at her side. "Ms. Hackman, your table is ready," he announced, his tone efficient but warm. The woman's eyes lit up with opportunity. "We were just getting acquainted. Perhaps we could join her. It seems there's been some mix-up with our reservation." Marcel's expression remained neutral, but Catherine noticed a slight stiffening in his posture. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, madame. Ms. Hackman's reservation is for one." "But surely exceptions can be made," the woman pressed, touching Catherine's arm in a gesture of false familiarity. "We're practically friends now, aren't we?" Before Catherine could respond, Marcel intervened with practiced diplomacy. "Our policy is quite strict regarding table assignments, madame. However, I believe we've located a table for you as well. If you'd follow Pierre, he'll escort you." As a junior waiter approached to lead the couple away, the woman leaned in close to Catherine. "We should exchange numbers. I'm sure my father would love to meet yours." Catherine smiled politely but non-committally, relieved when Marcel guided her toward her table, situated in a quiet corner with an excellent view of both the dining room and the open kitchen beyond. As she settled into her chair, she couldn't help but notice how Marcel's demeanor shifted subtly, a professional warmth replaced by something cooler, more calculated. "Will you be dining alone this evening, Ms. Hackman?" he asked, his tone carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. "Yes," Catherine replied simply. "Just me tonight." Marcel nodded, his expression unreadable. "Very good. Chef Beaumont has prepared a special tasting menu this evening. Would you care to see it, or would you prefer to order à la carte?" There was something in his inflection that gave Catherine pause, a subtle emphasis on special that suggested the kind of preferential treatment she had specifically requested not to receive. "I'd like to see both, please," she said, watching his reaction closely. As Marcel handed her the menus, their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Catherine sensed the evening would not unfold as simply as she had hoped. Little did she know that this intuition would prove prophetic, as the immaculately dressed head waiter was about to set in motion a chain of events that would end with him wishing he had never heard the name Hackman at all. The culinary symphony of Le Ciel Bleu orchestrated itself around Catherine with practiced precision. White-gloved servers moved between tables with balletic grace, sommeliers poured rare vintages with reverent care, and the gentle clink of fine china provided a subtle backbeat to the evening's performance. Catherine studied the regular menu first, noting the restaurant's signature dishes, a truffle-infused risotto that commanded a price equivalent to a decent bottle of wine, a Dover sole prepared tableside that cost more than many people's daily wages. When she turned to the special tasting menu, she immediately understood what had given her pause earlier. This wasn't just the chef's regular tasting menu. It was clearly customized, with dishes that nodded conspicuously to films in her father's repertoire: a French Connection foie gras, a Mississippi burning spiced prawns, even a Royal Tenenbaums family-style dessert platter. It was exactly the kind of attention she had specifically asked to avoid. Marcel hovered nearby, an expectant smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The chef was quite excited to learn of your visit," he explained, his voice pitched low as if sharing a confidence. "He's a tremendous admirer of your father's work." Catherine placed both menus down with deliberate care. "I appreciate the chef's enthusiasm," she said evenly, "but I'd prefer to order from the regular menu, and I specifically requested no special treatment when I made my reservation." Something flickered across Marcel's face, surprise perhaps, or the faintest trace of irritation. "Of course, madame. However, I assure you this is simply Chef Beaumont's way of honoring a distinguished guest. Your father's contributions to American cinema are legendary." "My father's contributions to cinema have nothing to do with my dinner," Catherine replied, her tone firm but not confrontational. "I'd like the roasted beet salad to start, followed by the turbot." Marcel's professional smile remained fixed, but his eyes had cooled considerably. "As you wish, madame, though I must say, many of our guests would be delighted by such personalized attention." "I'm not many of your guests," Catherine said simply. "Just one person hoping to enjoy a quiet meal." With a stiff nod, Marcel departed, leaving Catherine with the distinct impression that she had somehow failed to play her assigned role in the evening's script. She took a sip of water, observing how Marcel stopped to exchange words with another server, both glancing in her direction with poorly concealed interest. Catherine was accustomed to this, the subtle disappointment people exhibited when she failed to embody their expectations of celebrity offspring. Some expected flamboyance, others entitled behavior. Few seemed prepared for her preference for anonymity, for being judged on her own merits rather than her genetic connection to fame. Across the room, the couple from the bar had been seated at a less desirable table near the kitchen doors. The woman was gesturing animatedly, clearly dissatisfied with their placement. Catherine watched as Marcel approached their table, his posture now the embodiment of deferential service as he listened to their complaints. A moment later, he signaled to another server, and a bottle of champagne appeared, a peace offering for their inconvenience. Catherine's appetizer arrived, presented by a different server, a young woman who placed the beautifully arranged beet salad before her with a genuine smile. "Enjoy your meal, madame." The salad was exquisite, earthy beets paired with tangy goat cheese, dressed in a subtle vinaigrette that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the natural flavors. Catherine made mental notes as she ate, appreciating the technical skill evident in even this seemingly simple dish. Marcel reappeared as she finished, his demeanor now carefully neutral. "How did you find the salad, Ms. Hackman?" "Excellent," Catherine replied honestly. "Perfect balance of flavors." "Indeed," Marcel said, his tone suggesting he had expected no less. "Your main course will be out shortly. I've taken the liberty of suggesting a wine pairing to complement the turbot." Before Catherine could respond, he had summoned the sommelier, who approached with a bottle of white Burgundy. "A 2018 Pouligny Montrachet," the sommelier explained, presenting the label for her inspection. "Elegant, with notes of citrus and a mineral finish that will enhance the delicate flavor of the fish." Catherine recognized the bottle. It was among the most expensive on the wine list, easily 3 times the price of what she might have chosen for herself. She glanced at Marcel, who stood watching, with an expression that bordered on challenging. "I appreciate the suggestion," she said carefully, "but I'm actually in the mood for something lighter. Perhaps a Sancerre instead?" The sommelier's eyes flicked to Marcel, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, madame. An excellent choice as well." As they departed to fetch the requested wine, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that some subtle power struggle was unfolding, one in which she was being tested and found wanting. Marcel's attentiveness had an edge to it now, his courtesy a thin veneer over something that felt increasingly like disdain. Her main course arrived, turbot perfectly cooked, served with a delicate herb sauce and seasonal vegetables. The presentation was impeccable, the fish flaking at the touch of her fork. Yet, as she took her first bite, she became aware of Marcel standing nearby, observing her reaction with unusual intensity. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Ms. Hackman?" he inquired, his tone suggesting that it could not possibly be otherwise. "It's wonderful," Catherine confirmed, noting the technical precision of the dish. "The fish is cooked perfectly." "Chef Beaumont will be pleased to hear it," Marcel said, though his expression suggested doubt. "Though I must say the special tasting menu would have offered even more remarkable experiences. Perhaps on your next visit, you might be more adventurous." The comment hung in the air between them, not quite rude enough to warrant offense, yet loaded with implication. Catherine met his gaze steadily. "I find there's often more courage in simplicity than in spectacle, don't you?" Marcel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. An interesting perspective from someone who grew up in Hollywood. And there it was, the assumption that had followed Catherine her entire life, that growing up adjacent to fame had somehow defined her, that her experiences could be neatly categorized based on her father's profession. "I grew up in a family, Marcel," she replied quietly, "just like everyone else." Something shifted in his expression then, a hardening around the eyes, a slight flaring of the nostrils that suggested her response had struck a nerve. With a curt nod, he withdrew, moving to attend to other tables with exaggerated solicitude. As Catherine continued her meal, she became aware of subtle changes in the service. Water glasses refilled less promptly, longer waits between courses, a general cooling of the attentiveness that had marked the beginning of her dinner. It wasn't overt enough to complain about, but the message was clear. She had failed to play by the unwritten rules of celebrity dining. The couple from the bar, meanwhile, seemed to be receiving increasingly effusive service. Marcel personally attended to their table, leaning in to share what appeared to be confidential recommendations, laughing at their comments with practiced charm. Occasionally, their glances drifted toward Catherine, curious, evaluating, as if trying to reconcile her ordinary behavior with her extraordinary parentage. As Catherine finished her main course, she sensed the evening was building toward some inevitable confrontation, one that would soon reveal exactly what happened when the daughter of Hollywood royalty refused to wear her crown. The dessert menu arrived with a certain theatrical flourish, presented by Marcel with renewed attention that felt more performative than genuine. His smile never reached his eyes as he recommended the restaurant's signature soufflé. "A true masterpiece that requires 20 minutes to prepare, but I assure you, Ms. Hackman, it's worth every moment of anticipation." "I'll just have an espresso, thank you," Catherine replied, noticing the slight tightening of Marcel's jaw at her modest selection. "Are you quite certain?" he pressed, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Chef Beaumont's Grand Marnier soufflé has been featured in Bon Appetit. Your father sampled it himself when he dined with us last spring. He was most complimentary." Catherine's expression remained neutral, though something flickered behind her eyes. Not surprise at the mention of her father, but a quiet resignation, as if Marcel had finally played a card she had been expecting all evening. "Just the espresso," she repeated firmly. Marcel withdrew with barely concealed disappointment, moving directly to the table where the couple from the bar sat lingering over their entrees. Catherine watched as he leaned down, engaging them in animated conversation, his gestures more expansive than professional service typically warranted. Occasionally, all three would glance in her direction, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The restaurant had begun to empty, the early dinner crowd departing, while the later seating had yet to arrive in full force. In this temporary lull, voices carried more clearly across the dining room, and Catherine couldn't help but overhear fragments of Marcel's conversation with the couple. "Wouldn't know good taste if it—" Marcel's voice, pitched low but audible, carried an unmistakable note of disdain. "Imagine turning down chef's special menu." The woman responded, her tone one of scandalized delight at being included in this insider critique. "These celebrity children, born with silver spoons," the man added, loud enough that several nearby diners turned their heads. Catherine's espresso arrived, delivered by the same young server who had brought her appetizer. The girl's expression was apologetic, suggesting she too had overheard the ongoing commentary. "Is there anything else I can bring you, Ms. Hackman?" she asked quietly. Just the check, please, Catherine replied, offering a small smile that acknowledged their unspoken understanding. As the server departed, Marcel detached himself from the couple's table and made his way back toward Catherine, stopping to check on other diners along the way. His performance of attentiveness had taken on an almost mocking quality now, his courtesies exaggerated to the point of parody. "How was your espresso, Ms. Hackman?" he inquired, standing just slightly closer than propriety dictated. "Sufficiently ordinary for your tastes?" The emphasis he placed on ordinary carried an unmistakable sting, transforming the word into an accusation rather than a description. "The espresso was perfect," Catherine replied evenly. "Everything this evening has been excellent." "And yet you declined our chef's special offerings," Marcel observed, the veneer of professionalism growing thinner with each exchange. One can't help but wonder why someone would choose the commonplace when the extraordinary is available. Catherine met his gaze directly. "Perhaps because the extraordinary should stand on its own merits, not on borrowed prestige." Marcel's expression hardened. "Some might consider that ungrateful, Ms. Hackman, given your fortunate circumstances." The implication hung in the air between them, that Catherine's entire existence was a product of privilege, that her very presence in the restaurant was only meaningful because of whose daughter she was. "My circumstances are my own, Marcel," she said quietly, "just as my dinner choices are." "Indeed," he replied, his tone now openly contemptuous, though one might question the judgment of someone who has clearly coasted through life on a famous name while contributing nothing of substance herself. Several nearby diners looked up in shock at this unmistakable breach of professional conduct. The young server who had been approaching with Catherine's check stopped in her tracks, eyes widening. Catherine remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged, save for a slight raising of her eyebrows. "Is that your professional assessment of me, Marcel?" "It is my observation," he replied, abandoning all pretense of service now. "That you sit here, enjoying privileges you've done nothing to earn, while rejecting the very acknowledgement of what makes you noteworthy. Do you know how many truly talented, truly deserving people would give anything for the opportunities you've been handed? People with actual skill and vision?" The dining room had fallen eerily silent, the remaining patrons watching this unprecedented scene unfold with uncomfortable fascination. Even the couple from the bar seemed taken aback by the public nature of Marcel's attack. "I see," Catherine said, her voice still measured despite the provocation. "And what exactly do you know about my work, Marcel?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "I know enough," he replied dismissively. "Jean Hackman's daughter playing at being a food writer. How difficult that must be for you." Catherine nodded thoughtfully as if considering his words. "You're right about one thing. I am Jean Hackman's daughter. That's a biological fact I've never denied." She reached for her purse, extracting a credit card which she placed on the table. "What you don't seem to know, Marcel, is that I'm also Catherine Hackman, the food critic who will be reviewing Le Ciel Bleu for the New York Times next week." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcel's face drained of color so rapidly that for a moment he appeared on the verge of collapse. That's impossible," he stammered. "The Times reviewer is coming next month. We were informed." "The Times never announces its reviews in advance," Catherine interrupted gently. "That would defeat the purpose of an unbiased assessment, wouldn't it?" She reached back into her purse and produced a small leather folio, opening it to reveal press credentials bearing the unmistakable New York Times logo alongside her photograph. "I specifically requested to dine anonymously tonight, a request that was clearly ignored from the moment you recognized my surname." Marcel's expression transformed from shock to horror as the full implications dawned on him. Not only had he provided substandard service to a Times critic, but he had done so deliberately and culminated the experience with a public dressing down that had been witnessed by a room full of diners. "Ms. Hackman," he began, his voice now trembling slightly, "there has clearly been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding at all," Catherine replied, her tone professional but firm. "You made assumptions about who I am and what I deserve based solely on my parentage. You attempted to pressure me into accepting special treatment I hadn't requested. When I declined, you responded with increasingly poor service, and ultimately with open hostility. She glanced around the dining room, where diners were now either watching openly or pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. All of which will, of course, feature prominently in my review. Marcel's face had taken on a grayish hue. Please, Ms. Hackman, my position here, my career, depends on providing exemplary service to all guests, not just those you deem worthy of your attention, Catherine finished for him. Yes, I imagine it does. From across the room came the sound of a door opening, and a tall, distinguished man in chef's whites emerged from the kitchen. Chef Beaumont himself, alerted by staff to the unfolding situation, approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding respect. Ms. Hackman, he said, his French accent more pronounced under stress. I must apologize for any irregularities in your service this evening. Perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office? Catherine regarded him thoughtfully. I think everything that needs to be said has been said, Chef. I came here to experience your restaurant as any diner would. That experience has been informative. As the chef processed this response, his gaze shifted to Marcel, who stood frozen in place, the full weight of his actions visibly crushing down upon him. In that moment, it became abundantly clear to everyone present that Marcel's career at Le Ciel Bleu had just come to an abrupt and inglorious end. What no one in the dining room yet realized, however, was that this public humiliation was only the beginning of Marcel's reckoning, and that Catherine Hackman's most powerful response had yet to be revealed. The following morning, Catherine Hackman sat at her desk in her modest Brooklyn apartment, fingers hovering over her keyboard as she contemplated how to begin her review of Le Ciel Bleu. The events of the previous evening played through her mind with cinematic clarity. Marcel's progressive disdain, his public condemnation, the horrified realization that spread across his face when she revealed her true purpose at the restaurant. It would be so easy to craft a scathing review, to exercise the considerable power of her platform, to ensure that both Marcel and Le Ciel Bleu paid dearly for their treatment of her. Yet something held her back. Throughout her career, Catherine had prided herself on fairness, on evaluating restaurants solely on the merits of their food and service, without allowing personal feelings to cloud her judgment. The turbot had been impeccably prepared. The beet salad had demonstrated genuine culinary skill. Did one waiter's inappropriate behavior warrant condemning an entire establishment? Her phone buzzed with an incoming call, her editor at the Times, no doubt eager to hear about her experience. Catherine let it go to voicemail, needing more time to process her thoughts before sharing them. Outside her window, the Brooklyn neighborhood was coming alive with morning activity. A far cry from the rarefied atmosphere of Le Ciel Bleu, with its crystal chandeliers and whispered conversations about wealth and status. Catherine had chosen this neighborhood deliberately, preferring its unpretentious charm to the more fashionable Manhattan addresses her salary could have afforded. It was part of her ongoing effort to evaluate food on its merits, rather than its surroundings, to judge substance over spectacle. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text. Not her editor, but Chef Beaumont himself. Ms. Hackman, I cannot express the depth of my regret regarding last night's events. Marcel has been terminated effective immediately. I would greatly appreciate the opportunity to make this right. Please allow me to host you again on the house to demonstrate that his views do not reflect our establishment's values. Catherine set the phone down without responding. Another message arrived moments later, this one from an unknown number. Ms. Hackman, this is Marcel Dupont. I have obtained your number from a colleague. I beg you for mercy. My behavior was inexcusable, but a negative review will end my career in this city. I have a family to support. Please consider the consequences. The naked desperation in the message gave Catherine pause. She had never intended to be in this position of power over someone else's livelihood, regardless of how poorly they had treated her. Her reviews had always focused on the food, the ambiance, the overall experience, not on targeting individuals for punishment. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her contemplation. When she opened it, she found a delivery man holding an enormous arrangement of flowers. Catherine Hackman? He asked, consulting his clipboard. Yes, she confirmed, stepping aside to allow him to place the arrangement on her entryway table. "There's a card," he said, pointing to a small envelope nestled among the blooms. After he departed, Catherine extracted the card. "With my most profound apologies and hope for your forgiveness, Chef Bernard Beaumont, Le Ciel Bleu." She placed the card on her desk beside her laptop, where the cursor still blinked on a blank document. The expected review remained unwritten, but in her mind, the outline was taking shape. Not a vindictive takedown, but something more nuanced, more thoughtful. Something that acknowledged both the excellence of the cuisine and the failure of service without surrendering to the temptation of personal retribution. Her phone rang again, her father this time. Catherine smiled slightly, wondering if news of the incident had somehow reached him already. Gene Hackman had long since retired from acting, preferring the quiet life of painting and writing in his New Mexico home, but he still maintained connections in New York. "Morning, Dad," she answered, settling into her favorite reading chair. "Catherine." Her father's familiar gravelly voice came through the speaker. "Just checking in. How did the review dinner go last night?" Catherine hesitated, considering how much to share. "It was educational," she finally replied. Her father chuckled, the sound warm and knowing. "That bad, huh?" "The food was excellent," Catherine clarified. "The service was complicated." "Ah," Gene said, understanding in that single syllable. "Did the Hackman name come into play?" It was an old conversation between them, how Catherine navigated the complicated terrain of being the daughter of a celebrity while forging her own professional identity. Unlike many of her peers who had leveraged famous parentage into modeling contracts or reality show appearances, Catherine had deliberately chosen a path where her work could stand on its own merits. "It did," she admitted, "but not in the way you might think. The head waiter recognized me, tried to give me special treatment, then became increasingly hostile when I declined it." "Sounds like a real charmer," Gene remarked dryly. "He's been fired," Catherine said, still processing how she felt about this outcome. "And now I have to decide what to write." There was a pause on the line, her father allowing her the space to think. Finally, he asked, "What would you write if this had happened to any other diner?" The question crystallized something for Catherine. "I'd write the truth, that the food demonstrates exceptional skill, but that the service reflects a troubling elitism that undermines the dining experience." "Then write that," Gene suggested simply. "You've earned your reputation for integrity, Catherine. Don't compromise it now, either by holding back or by going for the jugular." After the call ended, Catherine returned to her laptop with renewed clarity. Her fingers began to move across the keyboard, crafting a review that was honest, fair, and ultimately more devastating in its measured assessment than any angry takedown could have been. 2 weeks later, her review appeared in the dining section of the New York Times. The headline read, "At Le Ciel Bleu, Culinary Excellence Overshadowed by Hierarchical Service." The article praised Chef Beaumont's technical mastery, while calmly detailing how the restaurant's approach to service reinforced troubling class distinctions, creating an environment where some diners were deemed more worthy than others based on factors unrelated to their appreciation of fine cuisine. Catherine did not name Marcel specifically, nor did she detail her personal experience. Instead, she broadened her focus to examine the culture that had enabled his behavior, a culture prevalent in many high-end establishments where the trappings of exclusivity often overshadowed the democratic pleasure of good food well served. The response was immediate and far-reaching. Reservation cancellations flooded Le Ciel Bleu's booking system. Food industry publications picked up the story, expanding on Catherine's critique to examine elitism in fine dining more broadly. Chef Beaumont appeared on a morning show, admitting that the review had prompted a complete reassessment of our service philosophy and announcing new training programs focused on equitable treatment of all guests. Marcel, meanwhile, discovered that Catherine's restraint in not naming him had done little to shield him from consequences. Word had spread throughout New York's close-knit restaurant community, and doors that had once been open to him were now firmly closed. His technical skills as a server were unquestionable, but his judgment had been deemed fatally flawed. 3 months after her review was published, Catherine received a letter with a New Orleans postmark. Inside was a simple note. Mrs. Hackman, You had every right to destroy me completely. Your restraint has given me a second chance I did not deserve, but will work every day to earn. I am now employed at a neighborhood bistro where I am learning what true service means. With humble gratitude, Marcel Dupont. Catherine placed the letter in a folder with other responses to her work. There was no vindication in knowing that Marcel had been forced to relocate, no satisfaction in his downfall. What mattered was that her review had sparked genuine reflection about the purpose of fine dining, whether it existed to reinforce social hierarchies or to celebrate the universal pleasure of exceptional food, regardless of who was eating it. 1 week later, Catherine entered a modest family-owned restaurant in Queens, notepad discreetly tucked into her purse. No one here would recognize her name or face. There would be no special treatment, no customized menu, no assumptions about her worth based on her lineage. Just honest food and straightforward service to be judged entirely on their merits. And in that anonymity, Catherine Hackman, food critic, professional in her own right, and incidentally, daughter of Hollywood royalty, found exactly the respect she had always sought. The kind that was earned rather than inherited, based on who she was rather than whose daughter she happened to be.